So for the back neck facing, I traced it on some Violin on the fold so that I could make the one piece, because I needed to cut two of these, and on the fabric it was easier to cut it in the one. So that's both pieces all done. I got all this out of 2 meters for this top. With this piece, it's just slightly not on the straight grain because I just didn't feel like it was worth wasting, you know, extra meterage just to have that. And you got to make sure you cut 2 of these, as in 4 in total. 2 of these mirrored. So this, I cut these wrong side together, but you can also fold the fabric right sides together. And I made sure that all the pieces were in the same direction so that they're, just in case there's a nap, a design, a one-way design to the pattern. And with this center back, I decided I would take off the seam allowance and cut it on the fold as one less seam to sew, but I also feel it just looks nicer to not have that center back, given it's not an opening needed to, you know, for a zipper or anything. I haven't cut the elastic yet. There is a pattern piece for the elastic length. I just found that it wasn't flowy enough on the top. So if we look at the back of the top that I made before, it's got the elastic casing just in the back, but I don't know if it's because I chose a rayon fabric, but I mean, it's got cute elastic, but I'm umming and ahhing whether I should shirr it, but maybe I'll just do the elastic. I have cut the ties after all. I didn't add any length this time. I've cut it as per the pattern, so that'll be interesting to see how it turns out. I'm also going to do the full 1.5 centimeter seams. Okay, so this mirrored set is the front facing and this is a back facing. There's only one side of each piece, each set, sorry, that you need to interface, and I used a medium weight fusible interfacing for them. Okay, pattern piece 9 is the bodice front and sleeve, and it is open down the center front and neckline. So what we're going to do next is stay stitch down that neckline to stop it from stretching, and I took out the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance from the back, cut it on the fold, so now I have a one piece back that I will need to stay stitch around the neckline, and the stay stitching will help stop that from stretching. Okay, so this is the front, and I'm going to stay stitch just inside the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and if you're not sure, you can always just measure it. You can even get little seam guides. So for me, 1.5 is just there. So I'm going to stay stitch just inside the 1.5 line, and hopefully you'll see me. I've got it on automatic back stitch when I start and finish. You don't have to back stitch. It's a pretty wonky cut. That's okay. guiding it. You go as slow as you need to. Or as fast as you want to, or can. So there's no need to backstitch, so I'm just going to continue on. And I'll trim those threads. It's called chain sewing. So I'll trim those threads later. And then I'm also going to stay stitch the back neckline. It's just, you want to make sure you don't stretch it. Because that's the whole point, so that the neckline doesn't get stretched. So just turning my hand to guide the fabric. I'm going slow because it's a curve, and I'm trying to keep my hand out of the way. And then I'll just backstitch there. Now I'm using a machine that's probably a bit expensive, but any machine that does stretch stitch, and if you need a bit of an overlocker stitch, I do have an overlocker, which is what I will use today once I set it up. And you want matching thread, and I always start with a little sample piece of stitching, just to make sure that I've got that stitching at a good tension, which is 2.5 millimeters long, and it's fine. It's a good colour thread too, which is probably not good for videoing, but I'm going to wear this. Okay, the next step is, if you cut two halves of the back, you need to stitch that centre back seam. I don't need to, because I've obviously done that. Then I'm going to stitch the shoulder seams together. So that's the back one, and that's the front. So there is a notch at the top of each one, so you're going to match those notches, and pins will be handy. So what you do is pin it at one end, and when you pin, you go in twice so it's stronger, and then pin it at the neck end. This is right sides together. I don't remember if I said that. And you want to pin a couple of times so it's a stronger hold, and then match those notches. Pin at the notch, and then you're going to kind of find halfway as well as matching the seams. So if you've got a table, you can pin that down and then bring it back to the sewing machine. So I'm just going to pin it, and you can pin it as much as you need to. So now I'm going to stitch along that shoulder seam at 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitch. Now I'm just going to pull that needle out before I get anywhere close to it, And if you haven't pinned a lot, what you can do is use your fingers as a pin, just to hold it into place. And you want to match up the edges. Now I am sewing rayon, which moves a little bit. I don't think it's one of the suggested fabrics, but I'll double check. So, you know that. I'm using a 75/11 needle. So now I'm going to pin the other side. So you've got your armhole bit, goes down the bottom, and then you're matching your notches. That's just not far from the seam, the neck edge. So again, I'm pinning the neck, and the notch, and then I'm just going to match the ends and pin them, and then find that sort of center of that. And pin that down. Now I'm left-handed, so you may want to pull the pins out that way, so keep that in mind. Just take the first one, I don't want to run over it. Back stitch. And when I stop, I mean my machine has got a needle down position, so every time it stops it's going to stop needle down. But that just stops me from accidentally moving the seam, the stitching line. I'm trying not to stretch this fabric because it is on the cross grain along the sleeve. It's not a straight grain. Back stitch and trim your threads. Okay, so now we've got that done, we're going to do the facing. So we've got one side interfaced, which is what I'm going to play with first. You've got your back neck, and your front. So you can see there's two notches at the top and notches at the top, so they are the bits that go together, right sides. And you'll see it's slightly off angle, which means that's the right way to have it. stitch that at the same 1.5 centimetre, back stitching at each end. And then I'm going to have that right side up, right sides together, and because this is the interface, it's quite firm, so I'm not going to pin this one. Again, back stitch at each end. So you can just trim. And there you've got one side of the facing done. I'm going to repeat that with the non-interface pieces. You can see how this moves quite a bit, so I'll pin this. Pin one and hold it. Should be fun. So I've let that slide a little bit, so I'm just going to unpick that and then just straighten it up and fix it. So I've just unpicked the little bit that I got wrong, and just from the other side I'm just going to line that up and backstitch. And so up to, I've only unpicked to about there, so I'm just going to go a little bit over my previous stitching, backstitch, didn't need to clip it. So now what I'm going to do is press all those seams open. So when I press the seams, first of all I press on the stitching, and then finger press them open. And there we go, lovely pressed seams. So I forgot to mention I was going to overlock the seams, which I've done. I've pressed them flat. Now what we want to do is take the interfaced piece of the neckline facing and top, and we're going to pin the outside circle, right side, to the bodice top. So I'm going to start at the back. There's 2 notches either side of the centre back. So match those notches and pin. Now I am going to stitch from the top side so I can see where the stay stitching line is. So I'm going to put the pins on this side, and then I'm going to get the next notch, match that up and pin in place. Then I'm going to find the centre back, just using my hands to even that fabrics. Kind of like making my hands the stitching, if that makes sense. Finding a middle and pinning that in place. And then I'm going to do another pin at the halfway point between centre back and the notch. And then we're going to pin the shoulder seams of the front facing and back neck facing with the front, and we're just going to match that seam. I'm not sure you can see that. And again I'm doing that double pin so it will hold, and then I'm going to ease the neckline into that curve and place some pins like I'm stitching with my fingers, if that makes sense. Now because one curve is inwards and one curve is outwards, the pattern actually says to clip into that. I'm not going to clip into it at this stage. I'll clip into it after I've stitched it. So now I'm going down the front, and there is a notch down the bottom to match up. Going to lay that down. It should match up nicely in between those notches without stretching the neckline. Going to need to get pattern piece out again, because there is a part that you don't sew. That I need to mark, because that's my starting and finishing point. Now I'm going to use a lot of pins because I don't want it to move. go. And then pin that so it's in the right location. And now we're going to pin the other side first, the side seams, or shoulder seam, sorry. Match the stitching line up. Now a trick to try and match that up is to pin along the stitching line on one side and then just check, and I'm out a little bit. I didn't get into the stitching line, so I'm just going to move, scratch it with my fingers. And then it should match. It's quite a little bit out, but I'm fine with that. Then I'm going to mold it because it's a concave with a opposite of a concave. I just can't think of what it's called at the moment. So that to me looks like it's going to get a little bit bubbly, so I may need to clip into the curves. So I'm just trying to sew it with pins at the moment so I can see how that's going to fit together. Just continue pinning. Matching those notches and the end point. And I'm also going to pin, because I'm going to sew this way, I'm just going to stitch, pin those seams down so that I don't accidentally go over them. And again on this side too. So it looks like I'm going to need to clip into those seams to the stay stitching line. Let me double check. I'm going to carefully clip in to the stay stitching line that I did on the top so that I can just get a bit more maneuverability. So you can see that's already opening up a lot flatter, so that'll be easier. So I'm just going to pin that again. So the stay stitching line just make sure you do not clip through your stitches. So that's a lot easier, and that's going to be a lot easier to sew. We'll do the same with the curve at the back of the neck. So I don't know if you can see this. Okay, so if you can see that, it's very bubbly as opposed to, well, it's bubbly but the front is fitting nicer, whereas that's really hard to sit flat. So now I'm going to trim close to but not through that stay stitching in that, just the top layer, and just gives that little bit of maneuverability around that curve. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch, like I said, from the top. I've got my pin container handy to throw them in as I get to them. Set at 2.5 still, and we're going to do 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Oops. Okay, don't mind me. We're actually stitching all the way for this part. What you want to be careful of is make sure that you're stitching on or over towards that way, towards the body. That's day stitching line, and you will feel that that's the firmest part of the seam at the moment. Hopefully I don't cover this too much on my hands, but I will need to hold my hands there so I don't get any puckers. It's not the end of the world. I can fix any puckers I might get. So when you're stitching on the seam, you want to get close to the pin, just so that it doesn't move. Now I can see that there's a bit of a pucker there, so I'm going to let it up to release that, and then down again. So we just take it easy, make sure you're on the left side of the stay stitching. Nothing stuck underneath in getting caught, as you shouldn't be sewing through. Might look like it's pinching on that side, but it's again because I've got the inside with the outside curve fighting. The only place that's important is the stitching line to be and you also want to make sure you're keeping to your seam allowance. stitch at the end. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is just have a look and see if I've got any pleats, which I do not have, which is amazing. Oh, there's a little one there. So what I'm going to do is unpick that and ease it in again. So it's just there. I just want to unpick on either side a little bit. And then you can see that that's released it. And then what we need to do is just stitch it without doing that again. And you want to go over your last few stitches. So it's back stitch first. Just going to hold my fingers in the way so that I can keep it. And again, back stitch after you pass it. Now, did we get it? Yes, we got rid of it. There's a little bit of stay stitching showing through, but none of the nicks, so I can just undo that later. Alrighty. Now we have one side of the facing. So what it does, it'll sit like that, and then your facing there will go underneath. Okay. So now what we need to do is finish clipping the neck, that seam, so that it sits nice and flat. And it's going to, we will be layering the seam and pushing it towards the band. So if we push this towards the band, if we do that, you'll see that it's going to create a lot of bulk. So what we need to do is cut little V's out of this edging. You can see, I don't know if you can see, but it's curled up anyway, so that's a great place to put a little V. So again, just to the stitching, but not through it. And I'm also keeping away the back, the top part. And it'd be good, handy to have a bin near you. So I start with cutting out the corners. It's just easier with this flowy fabric to get into bigger. So on these outside curves you make a V, on the inside a little slit was fine. And along the actual centre back it's a straight bit, so you don't need to trim there, you just need to do it where it starts to curve with sharp pointed scissors, so you can get a nice little clip in there. I'm putting my thumb in between the seams so that I don't cut the other layer or anything else I shouldn't be. That was Now because we're going to press, when you're layering the seam, the outside part of the seam should be the longest and the inside should be the shortest when it's facing that way. So that way that'll hold it down. So given that, I'm going to start, and I can do this slightly longer scissors in this part. Keep that seam away, and I'm going to cut about half of that off, just over half that seam, keeping my finger separating the other side. You can do it from the back. Because I've cut those little V's out, it's obviously going to come in little bits, so I'm going to do that above a bin. Okay, so that's going to hold that down, but what we can do is, there's a difference, and I'm just going to trim a little bit off just so it's still longer than the thing. I want to make sure I don't cut any of my top. It's just easier if I do it this way, and that's layering the seam. So you have to have a think about, or have a read, which way the layers are going to be, and you want the outside layer to be the longest layer. Now what we need to do is just press that to the facing side, so it'll be the longer side showing. So what I'm doing is I'm just pulling it slightly and then pushing the seam over. Okay, so need the pattern piece of the front facing, and what I've done is it says to edge finish the uninterfaced side, and you can do that via overlocking, which is method I chose, or you can fold it over 1/4 inch and then stitch right along the edge to give it a nice finish. So now I've got this folded in half without twists, and I'm going to mark the circle on both pieces that comes on the pattern. I'm using a friction pen, which hopefully, no, I don't think you can see that. And then on the other side, I will turn the pattern over, and I will do that circle again. I've already done it on the top, which you can see a bit better, and so what we need to do is just stitch that far to join them on both pieces. Okay, so I've pinned where the circle is, and what I need to do is stitch down here at the seam allowance that we've been following. So I'm just putting where the pin is. Now I don't want to put the needle down yet. I want to take the pin out. And now I'm going to backstitch. So to the end, and then backstitch again. Then I'm going to repeat that. And just a tip, make sure it's not twisted, so you can fold it in half. I'm going to do the same with the top. Make sure it's not twisted. And then I might as well sew from the bottom to that dot. And there we go, that's done. So that makes the top one. So now what we're going to do is attach the facing in between that. So I'm just going to do right sides, two right sides. We're going to stitch from where we finished, so that'll be free, all the way around the neck and back. So this is a little bit, what we can do is just press that seam open with our finger, and the same one here. Rub your nail across it if you have one, and then I'm going to start from the shoulder seam, and I'm going to pin through the stitching line with a straighter pin. So I can see I'm through the stitching line on that side, but I'm off that side, so I'm just going to move that, pull that out and move that a little bit, and drop my pin, get another one. Can't show you, I've got to hold it. So we've got that stitching line and on that stitching line. Next shoulder seam. Just a little out. There we go. And then we're just going to lay that and use our fingers again as the stitching line to get the center. And then I'm going to measure about halfway through, pin again. Just a good idea to use some pins so they don't move around a lot, especially with this fabric that I've chosen. It's a bit fluid. And I leave the pins where I can out a little bit, so that just makes it easier to pull out. So now, without stretching the facing, I'm just going to pin this, continue pinning down the front. Because the uninterfaced piece can stretch, so you just need to be careful. want to get to match that stitching line. So I've managed to pull that a little bit, so I'm just going to undo. So it might be best to pin at there and then sort of halfway. Lay it down. Just going to ease that in. I'm going to do a fair few pins here so I can keep easing it in, which will make it easier when I stitch it without, hopefully, without making a little pin tuck. Okay, and now we've got to do this side. So I'm going to start at that point. And this time I put the pin where that stitching is, and so that's going to be free. So you can see that's got quite a bit of ease in that to get through. So I'm just going to take my time. And I'll fast forward this maybe. I've obviously stretched that facing a bit. And if you do get any little darts or you know, that what I showed you earlier, just unpick either side and you'll be able to ease it in a bit. Alrighty, so now I'm going to start stitching from the center front, and I'm aware that there's a pin on either side, so what you can do is just use the wheel to put that needle down all the way, then pull out that pin and start stitching. And back stitch. So I can see there's going to be some puckers in this, I think. So I'm trying to ease it in. This is going to be the seam that's going to sit on your neck, because this will go underneath. if you were worried about going through what I'm going through, what you can do is, before you really play around with that, is stay stitch it, like we did with the top. So I'm going to start to get a pin. I'm just lifting my foot so I can fit it better. So make sure you, before you lift your foot, you have your needle down. It's one feature that I really enjoy when I upgraded my machine. But don't get me wrong, I loved my other machine. I had to manually put the needle in place. Sorry if I'm covering this up a bit. It's just a lot of easing to do. Making sure my seam is laying flat underneath. Again, I'm trying to get to that needle point, and I'm going to start around this curve, pushing it outwards. And just slowly. Again, I'm just going to make sure that that seam's laying flat, which it is. Okay, so what we're going to do is continue stitching. Make sure you don't have anything else but what you want to stitch. And I'm going to move my hand that way to try and get that nice curve. Okay, so we're almost at the end. Use a stiletto. I'm just going to use this Tupperware citrus peeler, which I use as a turning tool. This side isn't as bad as the other side was in easing in. You can use a stiletto, some people have. Got a bit of a just going to back stitch. I think I got a pucker. Might be small enough. I can just scratch it out. See. Yeah, it's not too bad. Not going to worry about it. So there we go. Oh. Just got a little bit of a gap now. What I can do is just try and reconnect that part. Those few stitches that I missed. Now I'll take some close-up photos, but I've kind of connected that now. So what it's going to do is that's going to go to the back, and it goes all. Unfortunately, I ran out of memory, and then when I reconnected my camera, I forgot to connect up the sound. We just finished sewing the facing onto the bodice, and now we're going to layer that seam. We left the side seams undone as per the instructions, which makes it a lot easier to work with the neckline. So what we're going to do is layer that seam so that we can fold the seam towards the facing. Here's a closer look. So this time I'm going to cut about half or just over half of that seam around the neckline before I clip into it. It'll just make it easier. And then once I've finished that, I will go back and I will clip half of the gap between the new cut edge and the edge of the interface side. Here I am doing that now. So I'm cutting that half the gap between this edge and the new edge, because that's the side we're going to fold towards, so we want the interface side to be the longer half of the layer. Now we're going to clip into, but not through, those stitches of the neckline curves, the inward curves, and that allows it to open up nicely and gives you the ability to stay stitch that nicer without pleats. Now I'm going to press along the seam so that I can shrink up some of that excess seam line, gathering. Now what I'm going to do is press that facing seam towards the facing that's going to go underneath. So I just showed you a little pucker, but that's okay. It'll be fine to go underneath. And there I've missed pressing that gap a bit. So we'll continue pressing. And if you see, I'm just sort of pressing to get the facing over to the other side. Now I'm going to sort out this bottom bit, where I'm going to press those seams open, because what we will be doing later is turning them through to the wrong side when we attach the facing. So we're going to stay stitch the neckline, which we're going to stitch on this side, which is the facing side that'll be over, so you're not going to see it at the top. And what this will do, so if you can see that, you're going to stitch from that point around to the same point. So I'm trying not to catch in any of that seam other than the seam of this facing. What you want to do is stitch just a little bit. Now on my foot I've got two little lines. I'm just going to keep this seam along this line, and then that'll be fine. It's probably about 1/4 inch for those that work in inches, or I think it's 6 mils in millimeters. Actually, a little bit too far. Maybe half that distance. Back stitch. Well, that wasn't a good back stitching, but anyway. Yeah, I'm doing about halfway between that. Just this side of the stitch line. You don't want to pull on the seam because that'll give you a stretched neck. I'm just going to hold it around there, just making sure that the seam is flat, which it should be if you pressed it nicely. And I'll show you after I stitch this. I'm going slow because it's the corner. I'm just guiding it around the curve. Couldn't get out that pucker. I could have unpicked it, but I'm not gonna bother. so tiny. Turn that too much. You can see it's flat on the neck. And I just want to get to that point without sewing it over that other bit. So stop where I want and then back stitch. So I don't know if you can see that stitching line. Take a close up. So even though that's all curly, I didn't sew over and make any new pleats. So now what we're going to do is push that behind. See how you can, that a little bit of stay stitching helps roll that seam so you get a nice clean edge. Now we're going to turn the facing to the wrong side of the top. You can finish that edge by folding it under a little bit, or you can overlock it as I've done and just leave it flat. What you want to do is match the facing seam first and pin through the stitching line so that you can make sure that it's nicely aligned. And then you're going to continue to just roll that facing over, and the stay stitch ed makes it a lot easier, and just start pinning it through that stitching line where the band was connected to the top. You'll see that I've laid it flat to try and get a nice flat facing at the back. Now what I found was, because of all my extra length, I did end up getting a bit of a pucker at that shoulder because of all the excess fabric. I now think maybe I could have unpicked the shoulder and just moved the front facing just a little bit over to take out a bit of that extra gap, or if I had realised before I stitched the bottom on, to extend it past and just cut that little bit off. But it is what it is, and it's fine. It's sitting nicely, I think, finished. So just continue to pin, and what I'm doing is I'm pinning in the actual stitching line that we're going to stitch through, and then towards the facing. Because I'm left-handed, I'm going to pull the pins out from the left. So think about how you're going to sew and put the pins in the right direction. I'm just constantly checking that I do keep the facing behind in a nice flat way. And then once we pin this, we'll be ditch stitching along that band to hold that facing in place. If you have a label, now's a good time to put it in around the neckline so that you can be caught in that stitching. And the stay stitching really does help roll that seam nicely. And now we're at that bottom bit where we've turned it right through. to the edge and you have a nice clean neckline finish. That's all going to get caught into the seam. So what we're going to do is stitch. I'm also going to stay stitch across that bottom just to hold it in place. I'm going to press it first just so that it's nicely pressed and easier to sew then. I pressed the seam down just so it's nice and fresh, crisp. I've got these all pinned down at about, I don't know, a couple of inches apart. And now I'm going to start ditch stitching, so in that seam. Whoop. Knocked it out. I'll put these pins on this side so I can throw them in there. Back stitch. I'm just going to take my time and stitch in this ditch. I pull these out a bit like that. It'll be easy to pull them out as we go. I've got a bit of stay stitching that I haven't removed. I'll try and remove it later. Make sure it's all laying flat. I can actually feel the edge of my overlocking. Again, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm just moving my hands and quite get in the ditch. Again, when I stop, I make sure my needle is down so nothing shifts. And my eye is right on the needle, that line, this stitching, that's my focus point. I just want to make sure that it's flat, so I just flatten it out. Move my hands, like Ouija board hands, I think you call it. So I'm going to just back stitch. I'm going to pivot with my needle down, take this pin out, and then I'm going to just sew across this bottom to hold it in place. My bobbin thread burning me. So make sure you have enough bobbin thread, which I just had enough and I've just caught that. So I'm gonna, there's a few wayward seam threads here that I'm gonna get rid of. And there you go. So I had plenty that I could have rolled underneath, but I chose not to. if you do roll it underneath, you want to be able to catch it so it's not consistent. Maybe I might carefully overlock that. Need to do a few clip threading. That is your neckline done, other than a few clippings. So, oh, I caught that. That was the side with lots of easing. I don't know why that happened, but I'm not going to worry about it. But you could unpick that and try and ease it, but I actually think that there's too much fabric here to really ease it. If you can see that. So we'll see how it works. And I forgot to put a label in, but I've got enough overhang here, I could add one. So, next step is to stitch the underside, the side seams. So I'm just going to pin at the top. There is a notch close to the bottom, but if you just pin at the bottom, looks like I didn't put the notch on both front and back. Anyway, but on these, you don't really need them, because you need to match the whole seam, right? It's relatively small, so I just try not to stretch. If you scratch your fingernails, you can just move that top layer. And now, keep to the seam allowance you've been using. Oh, that's right. I'll pause and fill up my bobbin. Okay, so I have a new bobbin, and I'll put a photo how much I had left. Not much. So that's where we were at. We're going to join the side seams of the top, following the same seam allowance you have been. So by scratching the top, I can push that edges closer together. So I slow around the curve, and I turn my hand to get it curvy. Stitch the other side seam. Before I continue, I'm going to overlock that, and I'm going to either overlock or do a rolled hem on there before I roll it over, because I just want that finished. So the next, I'm going to skip to the next part so I can overlock this at the same time. Probably should have taken the pins off, but it's the skirt part of the top. These were both cut on the fold. So I just have the two side seams to do. So that's the top. Just gonna use my foot to hold it. And that's the top of the back. And I'm going to pin those side seams and sew them up. Matching notches. Dropping pins. Try and keep it on the table so it doesn't pull unnecessarily. Now what you should know is this is not on the straight grain, so it does have a lot of movement, so it is best to pin the tops and bottoms between the notches, and then you can see how that doesn't want to play nice. I'm just going to match that. See if that worked. Yep. And then I'm gonna pin in between, trying not to pull too much on that seam, just to ease it in. So I'm just gently feeding it through without pulling on it too much. Back stitch. And repeat for the other side seam. Making sure you don't twist it. So what I'm going to do now is overlock the side seams of the bodice and the skirt. I'm going to maybe roll hem both the bottom of the top as well as the sleeves, and then I'll be back. So I've cut the elastic to the size of the pattern, but I'm just not sure I'm going to use it still. I've finished overlocking the edges, and now what I'm going to do is place the buttonhole positioning. So I'm going to get a friction pen that comes off with heat and just mark where they need to go. Just matching the edge of the fabric. So now what I need to do is interface that area on the back. So I'm just going to use a scrap piece of interfacing, which is why I keep some of these not too small, not too big pieces, so that I can just use offcuts for little pieces like this. And I'm going to fuse that. Okay, I had to have a bit of lunch. I'm back. Just wanted to confirm what I've done. So I went overlocked. I did a rolled overlocked edge on there, but I also took off, I don't know if you remember, there was a bit of extra width, so I went around carefully and just chopped off a little bit more of that width with the overlocker. So what I also did was, I forgot I needed to hem this. I clipped into the curve so it's got more movement, and then I've overlocked as well so that there's no snipped overlocking threads in there. And now what I'm going to do is I've rolled 1 centimeter and then another centimeter. You can make whatever hem you want. It does have a hem amount on the pattern, and yeah, so I've decided to roll it 1 centimeter and 1 centimeter, even though I've got that overlocked edge rolled hem inside, just for a neater finish. I've pressed it, and now what I'm going to do is top stitch around, and I'm going to start from the side seam. I have also done the same to the hem of the skirt, so that what I want to do is stitch and catch that edge. So I want to make sure that I've got a good distance, so now I'm measuring. I'm just going to check it. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, so now what I'm going to do is just top stitch this hem, and I can feel the edge, so I want the edge to the left of my needle. I'm not going to backstitch because I'll come around again. And I'm just keeping an even hem stitching line. And just checking I am actually catching it, which I am. Gonna just pull this thread to the back. Gonna go over a few stitches, back stitch. And I'll clip that thread. Just checking I caught that, which I have. And you can't really tell if I messed up because it's a matching thread. Again, starting from the underarm seam. And I've just remembered where I put it last time, so I'm going to do that again. I'm not going to backstitch. Okay, I can't pull it through. I'm just going to trim it. Go over it, back stitch, done. Now I'm just going to put that aside for a moment and stitch the skirt hem before I tackle the buttonhole. Don't want to pull this too much because it is on the bias. Just want to feed it. Just checking I'm catching it. And there we go. Even though they're automatic thread cutter, I have missed a couple. What I can do is just hand sew that later. My speed sewing, I actually missed a lot. I'll just hand sew it later. Alrighty, so now we're going to do the buttonhole. So you need to refer to your machine. This machine comes with an automatic buttonhole. And I'm going to need a button that are the size that I want to make. So hold for a moment. Okay, so I've got this button. Just remember, I don't actually need the button, I just need the hole. So this pink button will work fine. It's about the size that I wanted. Now, before you attempt a button, always get a scrap fabric and attempt it on the scrap. So let's draw a little line. I'm going to start there, I'm going to go there. So it's going to start from the front. So what we need is to go to your buttonhole stitch, select what one you want to do. I am going to do just a rectangle. And I'm pretty sure it starts backwards, so what I want to do is, can't see the mark. Okay, so I had to sort out, I did a boo-boo on my machine. I had the buttonhole thing in the wrong location, so now I'm just going to do another quick test on the buttonhole. I don't know if you can see that, but it's just a little smaller than my elastic, which I think is going to be a good size. So there we go. Now for the real thing. Test as much as you like on your buttonhole, because you can't really unpick them. I mean, you can, but it's not gonna not ruin your fabric. So I'm starting from the middle because it goes backwards. Just using that pin to align that line. And I can see the line in there, so the T intersection, and this line is helping me stay straight. Okay, so now let's see that's stitched. I'm going to sew it from this side. Oops. Just smash it. And okay, so I've had a bit of camera issues, but what I've done is I've pinned the skirt to the top, matching the side seams, and I've decided I'm going to go sew this, and then in the front it's going to need a press. I've pinned all that down nicely, and what I need to now stitch is a 2 centimeter seam right around the waistline. So that has fitted in perfectly this time, not like my first attempt. So I'm going to start stitching from the side seam. Got to start somewhere, right? And I want to do a 2 centimeter seam. I might just double check. If you're a little, something you can do to check is make sure you're not going to stitch over your, so my 2 centimeter seam is going to be just shy of the buttonholes, which is what we want. So I'll start that again. I actually want to start before the actual thick part of the seam. Just lining that up along that mark. Now you can backstitch, but because you're coming right around, it doesn't matter. You can backstitch when you get back. And again, this seam is not on a straight grain, probably. So I'm just going to not pull it, but guide it. So what I did was I eased it between the side seam. It looks like my notches are off, but I probably cut them a little off. As long as the between the center front and the side seam was fine, it was fine. So now this is looking like a top. We've got a little bit of that buttonhole. So I'm going to stitch it from this side. and I'll just unpick that bit. So fix up a boo-boo. So now, no one will know what to do now. The pattern calls the skirt part, I'm going to call it a skirt, front and back, and obviously that's the bodice. So what I'm going to do is I need to trim down to 6 millimeters. So I need to trim about 1.5 centimeters off the bottom, so the skirt part seam. So I'm going to use my hand to, and it's not rocket science, you can just trim it to just under half that width. If you can see that. So I'm just trimming off. Just be careful that you don't cut your skirt, because that'll make you upset. Or your bodice, just the seam allowance. So now what we need to do is make a casing for our elastic. Now the instructions say to do is to fold it over and to stitch it down, but I'm a little worried that my elastic, because I've made a wider one, won't fit, so I'm just going to overlock that edge and be back. My elastic is going to be too wide for me to put through this, so I am going to attach it differently, but we'll get on to the next. I've overlocked that nicely, so at least it's a clean edge, and then I'm just going to stitch it down, but we'll figure it out together. For now, I'm going to make the drawstring, and I'm going to start with having a long thread to help you pull it through later. So I'm just going to fold it right sides together, and then just edge stitch it, not edge stitch it. I think it's about a 1/4 inch seam or 6 millimeters. So I'm gonna try not to pull it anyway, but I will have to put a little bit of pressure on it. The machine doesn't eat it up. I'm just feeding that through. Going to pull it out a bit, and so I can have some thread, and stitch the next one right sides together. And the thread will help me stop it from being eaten at the beginning. So the reason I want threads is so that I can pull this through using a bobbin, put it down, not sure this is going to fit through actually. Yeah. Just. Now to turn the next one out. Now, as you can see, it looks like I should have had about 1/4 inch wide elastic, not the maybe 12 inches, 12 millimeters. Just going to start pushing this in. Yep, I lost it. So how you're supposed to do it is attach this to the elastic. So you can see that my elastic is way too big, but that's all that I have. So what you're supposed to do to finish it off is tuck it in at one end, which is going to be fiddly but doable. And you can just slip stitch that closed, which I'll do off camera later. You can just sew this whole casing right round. For the drawstring and the elastic. Just gonna get some elastic. I'm gonna do it the right size. So for now, I'll just finish making the casing. Feel the overlocking here, so I'm just gonna stitch along that. So I'm pushing that seam underneath flat, feeling that edge, and trying to sew the same distance. You can of course pin this, press it, pin it, probably would be a good idea. Something happened to my stitching. My bobbin got all knotted because I just ran out of. Okay, that's the. I will have to end that for today and continue tomorrow because I got to go get some elastic and thread. Okay, so this is where I'm at. I have finished the neckline and attached it to the bodice with a 2cm hem. So if you can see that, the fancy sort of finish that we did where we stitched there is actually not even seen on the front. It's only seen in the back. And then it's encased in that 2cm seam, which I've not unpicked. I've not opened up these buttonholes yet. I've made the loops. What's supposed to happen is you attach the elastic between the two loops, which will sit at the back. Now, I haven't decided how I'm going to do that yet because I might not use elastic. I can't find the right size at the moment. What else can I tell you? So with a press, this hasn't been finally pressed. That should come out nicely. The hem, so the top is made so that it sits up, and I also notice, making it without adjusting it, that the pattern is a little shorter at the front than at the back. Also, I completely missed big sections of that, so I might do another row of stitching. So there's twin stitching, just to catch that. But otherwise, I'm pretty happy with the progress. I will do a second video on how I finished this. Thanks for watching, and if you like this content, please subscribe to see more. Also, leave me some feedback on how I can improve or what else you would like to see. But I'll continue doing some little pattern reviews, and then I might make little tutorials. I've made this tutorial today because someone reached out to me because she was really struggling with the neckline. So I hope this video has helped you put your neckline together. Thanks a lot.